Joining me now with more on the conflict in eastern Ukraine is Stephen Fish. He's a professor of political science at the University of California at Berkeley. Stephen, welcome. Separatists are pushing towards Mariupol. One media source here in the United States saying that they seem to have an infusion of vitality. How do you see things on the ground right now?
Well, there's an invasion going on. It's fairly straightforward. Russia is sending in large amounts of artillery, other military material, tanks, armed personnel carriers, and personnel into East Ukraine. This has become a war of conquest. It's fairly straightforward.
Henry Kissinger wrote in an op-ed piece months back that, and I'm quoting, he said Ukraine should not join NATO. He said that was something he opposed when it came up 7 years ago. Ukraine definitely pushing for it right now. How do you feel about it?
It's a very different situation than it was a few years ago. I think the idea of Ukrainian membership in NATO was not a good one. It was hastily taken. The Bush administration discussed the idea, but really the idea has been dead since 2008. By the time President Obama took office, very few people in the West were enthusiastic about it. It was clear that Ukrainian public opinion was divided on it. So it really hasn't been a big issue. And President Putin using it as a pretext for what he's doing now makes no sense in that context. But now, as you can imagine, with Putin doing what he is in eastern Ukraine, in southern Ukraine, it's possible that what's left of Ukraine is going to make a better case for joining NATO in order to protect itself. So that issue is now back on the table. How enthusiastic Western leaders will be to admit what's left of Ukraine after Putin gets done with the eastern and southern parts of it remains to be seen. But certainly one can understand why Ukraine would want to join at this point.
What do you think is going to come out of the NATO meetings in Wales?
I don't think these meetings really make all that much difference, Mike. I'll be honest with you. I think the situation on the ground is driving everything. President Putin is bent on pushing forward with this campaign of conquest and perhaps eventual annexation of parts of east and southern Ukraine. The Ukrainian government is having a very hard time fighting back. It was doing well against the rebels as long as it was just fighting the rebels with some Russian support. But now that the Russian government has thrown its full support in, invading Ukraine, it's very difficult for Ukraine to actually fight back against that. And that's where the action is right now. President Putin has shown very little interest in what Western powers think or what they care to do, very little interest in NATO's reaction so far. I think eventually he'll pay quite a price for that because he's going to have to deal with a revived NATO. But right now, what really matters is what's going on in east and southern Ukraine, not meetings being held elsewhere.
Okay, so you say he's going to pay a price. What would that price be? I mean, it doesn't seem like he's buckling. There's these economic sanctions. It doesn't seem to dissuade him in any way.
You're absolutely right about that. He's not been dissuaded from proceeding with his plan. But what's interesting is that the sanctions are beginning to bite. So far, they've been fairly modest, and they certainly could be ratcheted up. But every time Putin makes a move in East Ukraine, the ruble declines on international currency markets. Foreign investors and domestic investors in Russia want to pull their capital out, and oftentimes do. The Russian economy is stagnating now as a result of this and could begin contracting quite soon. So the way the sanctions work is interesting. Putin does not seem to be daunted by them at all, but eventually, and eventually probably means in coming months, it'll be fairly soon, Russia will start feeling the bite of these sanctions. Some Russian businessmen are already nervous. Some Russian consumers and ordinary people are already beginning to feel the effect of these sanctions. So I think the hope for the sanctions is that eventually they will help turn the Russian people and Russian elites against this program. But in the short run, as you point out, Putin is not daunted by them.
Stephen, I want to go back to the Kissinger op-ed because he said, you know, everything seems to be couched in this language. It's a showdown. But he said the test of policy is how it ends, not how it begins. How does this thing end?
I don't think we know, Mike. This is such a complicated situation. We have not seen since World War II a great power invade a smaller neighbor and start gobbling up its territory. Saddam Hussein did that in Kuwait and, of course, was rebuffed. But this is very unusual. This kind of thing, especially in Europe, just hasn't really been the norm. So we don't know how it's going to end. What we can say is that Putin's endgame seems to be domination of East Ukraine, maybe with formal annexation, like with Crimea, maybe without that, at least in the short run, and domination of Ukraine as a whole, at least geopolitically. But focusing on eastern and southern Ukraine, where, by the way, there's a lot of valuable industry, a lot of valuable minerals, and that seems to be his endgame, is basically taking over that part of Ukraine. The Ukrainian government doesn't have an endgame at all. They're just trying to survive as a state. Right now, they're trying to organize as much external support as they can, including this new talk of trying to enter NATO. And right now, they're just living day to day. It's hard to talk about an endgame for Kiev right now.
All right, Stephen Fish joining us from Northern California. Thank you.